You're listening to Workforce Innovation News, powered by LWIA 23. Get ready to hear about all things workforce development and workforce innovation. And now, on to the episode.
Hello and welcome to WIN, Workforce Innovation News. I am Jamie Korda-Hijawi, Director for LWIA 23. Today I have Dr. Justin Arnold with us from LWIA 17, the Champaign County Regional Planning Commission. Hi Justin, thanks for being with us today.
Hi Jamie, thanks for having me.
So Justin, I invited you because I really wanted to have some time to talk about what WIOA is as far as legislation goes. We've talked about what it is for customers, we've talked about what it is for businesses, but what is it really doing for the nation as a whole, and then what it does for the state, and just kind of drilling down a bit as legislation. What is it? Why is it important? Why is it legislation? And I really wanted to be able to give a platform for us to advocate with our local legislators, our chief elected officials, anyone who has influence over policy creation and legislation movement, so that we're able to leverage WIOA and its reauthorization to the best of its ability. So that's a lot of conversation, I think, and
It's
this
a big topic.
will probably end up being a two-parter. But I figured you would be the best person for this conversation today. So if you want to just start out introducing yourself, give a little bit of background of what you do, how you got to where you're at now, and then we can talk a little bit more about WIOA.
Sure. Let's see. Well, I've been in workforce development for about 20 years, and I currently am a workforce board director who's employed by a regional planning commission. So I kind of wear two hats. One, I have to help the workforce board do the things that are required by WIOA. And then two, within the Regional Planning Commission, there's a couple different divisions, like we're a community action agency, and we have the contracts with municipalities to do infrastructure planning. So it's figuring out how workforce development fits into that role with your organization. And that's not uncommon with directors. Their host organization requires them to participate in whatever that organization is. Mine happens to be a regional planning commission. So it's pretty exciting, never a dull moment. I got into this sort of work because I was a high school dropout and a foster kid and in and out of jails. And I went into manufacturing just because it was the best option to me in my 20s. And I spent the next roughly 8 years or so volunteering in my spare time at a nonprofit where I would help young adults and families learn employability skills, soft skills, wellness skills, financial literacy, those kinds of things. The second half of my 20-year career was saying, I want to do this for a living when I grow up instead of just volunteering. So then I went and got a bachelor and a master's and a PhD in it. And while I was doing that, I was a consultant and a teacher. Postdoc work was working in an extension program as a specialist, workforce specialist at a community college and a workforce development department. And then I ended up here as a board director, and it's a pretty good fit for who I am and what I want to try and do in my career. So really happy to be here.
That is like the full circle. You've gone through so many of the obstacles to success that WIOA is in place to try to help people over. So you've overcome those obstacles. You've gotten to a really awesome, I mean, I'm a little biased because I'm in workforce development too, but I think a really awesome career. And in that you're also giving back and helping those who are in similar situations as you were. So I really like your story because that full circle story, and it's really cool. It's exciting to hear.
Thank you.
So, all right. We know you've been involved with workforce development. Now we know why. So for our listeners who hopefully we have some local legislators listening, they hear me say WIOA and they're like, what is this crazy woman saying? What is Workforce Innovation Opportunity Act? Why is it important for people to know about workforce development?
Sure. WIOA legislation creates a national workforce development system that has infrastructure of state boards, local boards, and job centers. And so understanding that infrastructure is really vital to us as a country and to our future. Because if you don't tie workforce development to that infrastructure, then you're handicapping the infrastructure and you're putting impediments in front of employers and job seekers. So that's probably the first thing to really appreciate for legislators is that workforce development infrastructure already exists. The common thing to happen, whether it's state legislators or federal legislators, is to think that workforce development doesn't exist and they have to start from scratch. And so they always propose a new bill or a new program or a new department, which really causes problems nationally in states and in local areas.
So the infrastructure is there. You've talked about workforce boards. So what entities, what organization, who's all on workforce boards? What is the infrastructure? Who contributes to that infrastructure?
Sure. A workforce board is primarily employers. So employers are at the table giving feedback on local programs and if they're meeting the needs of emerging and leading industries. And they're talking to service providers and educators about what the needs of businesses are. So, for example, we need people with these types of skills, or if someone has a certificate, this is what it needs to teach to, or the people graduating with an associates are really missing this knowledge. Can you uh, bulk it up in that area? So primarily it's employers speaking to the value of local workforce programs and education programs. The other folks at the table are folks who are involved in the workforce system, and we'll get into Title One, Two, Three, and Four in a second. I'm sure. But the four titles from WIOA are all on the workforce board. And then other folks that are required to be there are business serving organizations like chambers or EDCs. Um, let's see, educational providers such as universities, community colleges, tech centers. There's a requirement for unions or labor management representation to be on there. There's encouragement to have organizations that are serving youth be on a board. So primarily um, employers, but then people who are involved in workforce development education are required to be on that board too. And the important thing about a board to remember is for legislators is unlike every other investment in one organization, an investment in a workforce board is an investment in a community.
Okay, yeah, that's a great way of looking at it. I didn't think of it that way before. It's an investment in the community. And you said the infrastructure is there. It is business led. So that is the boots on the ground. They're seeing what the workforce needs firsthand right there, and they're leading the boards. And then it's really like anyone who has a stake in the game when it comes to workforce development, economic development, education.
Hmm.
That's a robust infrastructure. That's not just a framework. Like we already have a really solid foundation going.
Right.
So why do you think it is that legislators or maybe just general public are so unaware of the infrastructure that's already in place and they're trying to at times recreate the wheel or try something different?
Sure. I think there's a couple different reasons, and I think they're pretty normal. Probably 10 years ago, I served as a planning commissioner in a city, and planning commissions have a 20-year master plan for a city. They contribute to zoning laws and districts in a city. They have power to approve new signage or um, drainage systems or et cetera, as long as those things align with a master plan and with zoning laws. And planning commissions are not something new. They've been around for a long time. They have a lot of power in a city. They're important to development, but no one knows what a planning commission is. But without a planning commission, you get a factory next to a house, next to a school, and cities are really poorly planned and they're not safe and they're not really healthy. Um, so the planning commissions are important and they exist and they do a job, but no one knows what they are. So in general, people really don't know about government. The way that people view government is I'm electing a president or I'm electing a party to Congress, and that's basically the extent of how they think about democracy or civic engagement. But people don't really think about local government and how cities work and regions work and states work outside of voting for a governor. So not knowing how a workforce board works, which is a government entity, it's not surprising. Most government is not visible or really understood. The surprising part is when partners at the table don't know what it is. And
Yes.
that's always, to me, an interesting situation is when partners will sit at a table for years, but still really not know what it is. And that just speaks to boards in general. So this isn't a workforce development issue. This is a board in general. Any nonprofit board, a board for United Way, a corporate board, any board in general that exists, period, has to have engaged members on it who are informed.
Mhm.
And so workforce boards throughout the country have different levels of engagement, different levels of um, information. And like every other board in the country and in the world, um, there's different levels of engagement and knowledge, which impacts how local workforce boards function.
Right, and the more diverse, boards you have, the more likely you are to have a various range of engagement. So we
Right,
want all these different voices at the table, but
right,
that's more people at the table,
right,
more personalities with just
right,
life going on,
right,
comprehension, what's important to them.
right.
So it's kind of double-edged sword, I guess is how the phrase saying
It
goes.
is. Government's not easy, and that's kind of the point sometimes,
Yeah,
is that it's supposed to be about accountability and preserving the public trust. Not it's not a business where it's supposed to just the easiest thing that one person wants.
right.
And so if you really appreciate civics, you can appreciate the fact that not everyone on a board is super engaged and you have to go through the process of engaging everybody. And that's part of self-government. And it's a responsibility and it's valuable. Um, and so if we don't look at it as a business, or if we don't look at it as this should be easy, but we look at it for what it is, which is self-government of people from different walks of life, then you can just go through the process of educating and informing and engaging, and you'll be happy with the process and results.
Justin, I've been doing this for 4.5 years, and
Hmm.
even just in the last 10 minutes, I've already, like, taken away 2 new things of, like, "This is what I should have been doing," or you've blown like, given me a
Nice. High five.
brainstorm, like, "Phew, I
Yeah.
need to do this." Alright, so we're talking about WIOA, we're talking about local government,
Hmm.
but we know that WIOA was due for reauthorization, like, in 2020-ish, I think.
Yes. Hmm.
It hasn't happened yet. We're on the cusp of it. Tell me a little bit about reauthorization, where we're at right now, and what you think we should expect in the next, year or 2.
Sure. Reauthorization is looking at a bill, taking the opportunity to make any changes, specifically with programs and funding levels, and then presenting that bill. It comes through the House and then goes to the Senate. Both the U.S. House and the U.S. Senate have different versions. And so the House reauthorization of WIOA took a look at it, and they looked at services and funding levels, and they put out a bill. And then the Senate looked at that bill and they put out their own version. And both the House and the Senate, after legislators put out a version of the bill, there's committees that look at it, there's public comment. And so we've gone through that process of versions of a bill, public comment, and committees. And right now it's at a place where the Senate has to vote on it to approve it, I believe.
Okay.
And then the version would go back to the House to approve it because this would be a new version. So there was some excitement that this would be um, reauthorized during the election cycle because of a desire to find something that was bipartisan, that both parties could agree on. And workforce development usually is a pretty bipartisan area of legislation that
Right.
everyone can walk away and say, we got to win on this one because we're helping job seekers and we're helping employers. However, with Biden dropping out and then with the assassination attempt on Trump, you have things that it's much more up in the air now.
Yeah.
So we don't really know as much as there was a sense of urgency 2 months ago that, there isn't that much urgency now. So it could still pass, but it might not pass until later in this year or early next year. Um, so it's kind of a wait and see kind of situation right now.
Well, I mean, I understand why things have slowed down a bit, but it is a little disappointing because I felt like we were really right there just about to have some really cool things happen. Um, but what out of the different iterations of the reauthorization that have come across our inboxes, what are some of the things that you're really hoping to see come from what is actually passed and the ideal changes to WIOA?
Yeah. I think keeping the funding levels the same or increasing them is probably the most important. WIOA is also is excuse me, WIOA is already underfunded. It's kept the same funding levels I've heard for 20 years. So when it was WIOA in 2014 and when it was WIA and I think like 98. So WIA and WIOA have kept pretty steady funding levels when wages and overhead costs and tuition costs and supportive services costs have all kind of skyrocketed. So keeping and funding levels haven't changed. So at least keeping them the same, if not increasing them, is probably the most important thing. A decrease to funding would have a very negative impact on the national system and then local workforce areas. So funding levels are probably the most important thing with this. As far as innovative changes, the a lot of the programs are will stay pretty much the same, which is kind of a good thing. Career services work, individualized training with supportive services work, employer engagement with incumbent worker training works. So a lot of the adult education works. So a lot of our services work. What people are interested in is removing some of the bureaucracy and the bureaucracy component. There's at least two of them right now that I can think of that make our jobs as directors really difficult because we're spending a lot of time on paperwork and meetings instead of just doing the job. And those two things are regional planning and one-stop operation negotiations. And so there's a discussion in the House and the Senate about because right now it's basically every 2 years you have to re-engage in a regional plan, which is ridiculous. It's so time consuming. So there's a discussion in the Senate about to eliminate that mid period review and go to a 4 or 5 year plan. So you do it once and then you don't go back to it every 2 years. So that would be good as far as eliminating some of that bureaucracy. And then the other one, the one-step infrastructure negotiations or shared that cover shared costs with required partners, that might be eliminated, where it's just, hey, this is the rate that you have to pay, and it's handled at kind of like a state level, and so we don't have to spend 6 months talking about, who's going to pay the water bill, which is a waste of everybody's time. So you hope they get eliminated so that we can just focus on the important parts of the job, which is engaging employers and serving the public.
I agree. I think the most fun part of the job is really getting to talk with the employers and talk with the job seekers and seeing their stories play out. But
Mhm.
I don't get to do that very often because I'm coordinating to get people together
Right.
to talk about a plan that we just talked about a couple
Right.
years ago
Right.
and that
Yeah.
we follow up on every year, but now we have to
Right.
replan again
Right.
and we have to negotiate and who's paying for the guard, who's not
Right.
paying for the guard.
Yeah.
Like these things are important, but they shouldn't be taking up the bulk of our time.
Right.
'Cause it's too easy then to forget why we are here and what we are doing and why it's so important. So
Right.
I'm excited for reauthorization.
Yeah.
Um, one of the things that I've noticed that I'm really excited that I hope go through is the definition change or the wording change for
Mm.
youth in school versus youth out of school to youth opportunity
Mhm.
or opportunity youth, I think it was.
Yep.
And that the like intent was really good of having uh the the goal to mostly serve youth out of school,
Mhm.
but also it the way it played out was that we were taking away some opportunities from youth who were in school. So
Mm.
really changing the definition a bit and just changing how we phrase it too, because I think we get
Mm,
stuck in that lingo and that doesn't
yeah.
translate when we do any outreach or try to raise visibility, um, to say something or use wording that's a little easier to understand and coincides with some other terminology out there in other sectors and initiatives. How do you feel about the potential changes to the youth section of
Sure.
reauthorization?
Yeah, that's something that I've kind of not really dug into. I've just kind of watched it like on the as a peripheral that opportunity youth would be changed, and then with adult ed there'd be a higher emphasis on digital literacy skills, and those two things I've kind of watched but haven't really dug into. So the idea with the opportunity youth is to not focus so much on the 75 out of school, 25 in school situation, and just talk about opportunity youth who have a barrier and could use some assistance.
Abs-
Okay.
Yeah,
Yeah, yeah, that would be helpful. I think that as far as like the system, that would probably give us more opportunities to work with high schools and EFEs than we currently have, because we're encouraged to collaborate with Perkins. And
right.
those Perkin funded opportunities in high school through EFEs in Illinois exist, but they're so in school and we were so out of school that it's hard to find some crossover. So maybe this helps us find ways to collaborate on opportunity youth instead of having to have really distinct lanes. Yeah, it could be beneficial.
Absolutely. When we have such a great infrastructure in place, but there's still parameters that make it hard
Mm,
to align and work together.
yeah,
There's some things that just kind of conflict with each other. And I'm
yeah,
hopeful that there'll be some change that gets passed that allows us to overlap just a bit, fill some gaps,
yeah,
um, and not necessarily duplicate, but fill some gaps there.
yeah. And I've heard from other directors that this is a topic of interest to them. Um, I do have concerns that because we focus on out of school youth intentionally to say either if you're a dropout or you've left school but you're not connected to education for or employment, we want to focus on you. And there wasn't anyone else focusing on those folks. So EFE was just looking at kids that were in school, and the community college was primarily looking at people who were kind of traditional students who didn't really have barriers. And so the folks that were falling through the cracks for us were those folks in either a metropolitan or rural area that had either dropped out of high school or had graduated high school but were connected to education for or employment, and that's a harder population to serve and find and recruit. Um, but with the emphasis from WIOA to do that, we took on that responsibility. I, one of my concerns is that if we take away that um, some of that emphasis of WIOA, that we're all just going to start doing high school career days instead of
Yeah.
helping kids that are that have the most need. So I guess there's opportunities for collaboration, but I also see a kind of a con to it. Hopefully we don't lose some of those folks that we have been serving historically. This is
I
just me
see what you're
talking out loud.
saying. No. Well, and it goes real back to the local what works for the local area. So
Mm,
for your
yes,
region, it might
yes,
be that does work better for you. In other regions, they don't have as much collaboration with EFEs and high schools, and that's more of a needs population for them. So to see that in the national legislation to where it's a little bit
flexibility.
yes, that's what I'm
Mm,
getting at. That flexibility, I think, would be helpful.
yeah, and I think that's a good point that you bring up, which is the importance of a local board is to identify what people should be working on locally. And when you have colleges and high schools and workforce and employers all at the table, you can make some good decisions. Um, so that's a good point. Local control matters. And they can
Well,
decide where the opportunity is for them. That makes sense.
absolutely. So to round out the first part of this conversation, let's finish off with just what can local legislators, what do you need them or what should we have them understand better so that they're able to support specific workforce development needs in their communities?
Really just understand that the infrastructure exists and to invest in the infrastructure, and that local control through local workforce boards matters. And I think if they can hear that message loudly and clearly, then that's the best we can hope for.
Infrastructure exists and local control is paramount. That is awesome. So I want our listeners to know just a little bit more about you. And since this is a special 2-part episode, before we go on to part 2, I want to ask you a couple rapid fire questions that you didn't anticipate. You cannot think about too much. You just have to answer.
Okay.
All right. So what part of the day are you most productive, Justin? Morning, afternoon, evening, or overnights?
Morning.
Morning. Awesome. If you could be any animal, what would you be?
Oh my goodness. Rhinoceros.
Why? Why a rhinoceros?
It just popped in my head. I did a report on it in like 5th grade. So I don't know. Just walk around and then lay down and go to sleep, I suppose.
I mean, it does sound pretty awesome. What's your favorite food?
I just had some lobster risotto this weekend. That was pretty delicious.
All right.
And
all right.
Effingham.
That is probably not what a rhinoceros would eat, though.
No, I don't
Thanks
think
for
so.
visiting my area.
Yeah.
What is success to you?
Achieving the vision that you have.
Achieving the vision that you have. I love it. All right. Well, thank you so much for part 1. We will get ready for part 2.
You've been listening to Workforce Innovation News powered by LWIA 23. Don't forget to subscribe to the podcast on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, or wherever you listen to podcasts. To learn more about LWIA 23, visit lwa23.net.